everyone to today's learning community. If you haven't done so yet, please go ahead and type your name and where you're from in the chat box so that we know who else is participating and we have an opportunity to find out the diversity of the group that's joined us. This learning community is hosted by the Family-Run Executive Director Leadership Association, better known as FREDLA. We're a partner in the National Technical Assistance Network for Children's Behavioral Health, which is operated and coordinated through the University of Maryland. For those not familiar with FREDLA or our learning community calls, FREDLA is a network of family-run organizations. There are about 120 family-run organizations across the country, and they were all started by families caring for a child or a young adult with mental health or behavioral health needs. FREDLA's mission is to build strong, sustainable family-run organizations and together influence policy and practice to support children and families. As I said, we are a partner in the National Training and Technical Assistance Center, and we collaborate with both state and national organizations and offer technical assistance and consultation to family-run organizations, states, and other stakeholders. My name is Millie Sweeney, and I'm the Deputy Director for FREDLA. Our main presenter today is Andrew Russo. He's the co-founder and director of the National Family Support Network, as well as the co-author of its Standards of Quality for Family Strengthening and Support that we'll learn about today. Also presenting today are Tammy Paul, the Deputy Director of the Oregon Family Support Network, and Tony Donnelly, the Director of Training and Innovation at the Family Involvement Center in Arizona. The title of our learning community today is Developing Family-Driven Practices, the National Family Support Network Standards of Quality for Family Strengthening and Support. System of care communities are challenged with developing and implementing a family-driven array of services and supports. The National Family Support Network offers the Standards of Quality, which is a framework with the vision that implementation will help ensure that families are supported and strengthened through quality practice. It was designed to be used by all stakeholders, public departments, foundations, community-based organizations, and parents across different kinds of family strengthening and family support programs as a tool for planning, providing, and assessing quality practice. Today, Andrew will provide an overview of the National Family Support Network, its standards of quality, and how the standards have been used to promote quality family support. We'll then hear directly from Tammy and Tony about their involvement with and use of the standards from the family organization perspective. Finally, there will be time to discuss how family leaders and family-run organizations can use the standards to bring communities together for implementation of quality family support practices in building a system of care for children, youth, and families during the Q&A session. I'm going to go back one slide. There are family-run organizations, or FROs, as we refer to them, and family support networks across the nation. On this map, the green-colored states are those with state chapters of the National Family Support Network, and the blue stars represent states that have local or statewide family organizations. This map highlights the collaboration possibilities and potential opportunities for partnering on family-driven care in nearly every state. What a great network of family support for systems of care to tap into. So let's go ahead and get started, and I'm going to turn this over to Andrew.
Thank you, Millie, and thank you to FREDLA for the opportunity to connect with you virtually today. We hope this webinar will be of use and interest to you. And in terms of looking at the map that Millie just shared, want to flag the 8 member networks that we currently have, 27 states and the District of Columbia. These are networks of family support and strengthening organizations, most commonly called family resource centers. And there are more than 3,000 of these centers nationwide. And as you see from the map, they exist in the reddest of red states and the bluest of blue states and many others in between. And this is particularly noteworthy because there's actually no dedicated federal funding for family resource centers. So it's pretty amazing that all these different states have seen the value of investing in these welcoming one-stop hubs of supports for families. Together, they serve more than 2 million of our 2 million people every year, supporting our nation's families to be healthy and strong. And the national network was co-founded in 2011 with 8 of these states at the table and has rapidly expanded to now the map that you see here, which is something we're very excited about. So if you happen to be from a state that isn't green on the map yet, we'd love to talk with you and learn more about the lay of the land in your state about services and supports for families. The mission of this national network is to promote positive outcomes for all children, families, and communities by leveraging the collective impact of these state networks and champion quality family support and strengthening practices and policies. That's where our work with the standards comes in particular. And our vision, simply put, is that that whole map would be colored in green, that all families would be able to access quality family support and strengthening supports in their communities. In terms of our areas of work, they're threefold. First is connecting our members to each other to learn from their fellow networks across the country. 2 of those networks are represented on today's call and will present after me. 2 is promoting family support best practice and evaluation. This is where our work with the nationally adopted standards of quality comes in that you're hearing about today. And finally, raising visibility about the value and impact of family support and strengthening networks and programs. We often talk about this work as America's best kept secret. So we're always glad for opportunities like the one today to promote awareness of this work and look for intersection points with the good work that so many others like you all are doing. The standards of quality that we'll be talking about today are here. The standards are the first and only standards to integrate and operationalize the principles of family support practice with the Strengthening Families approach and its research-based, evidence-informed 5 protective factors. So they bring 2 frameworks together that we'll be talking about today. As Millie mentioned earlier, they're designed to be used by all stakeholders. So public departments, foundations, community-based organizations, and families themselves as a tool for planning, providing, and assessing quality practice. So at all those 3 levels, when we're thinking about our programs in the first place, when we're actually implementing our programs, and when we're evaluating how we're doing. One of the great values of the standards is that they create a common language and expectations across different kinds of family support and strengthening programs, such as the family resource centers that I mentioned earlier, but actually they were intentionally written broadly that they could be used by any provider working with families, such as home visiting programs, child development programs, family serving organizations, of course, as well, that you'll hear more about today. They help ensure that families are supported and strengthened through quality practice. So as long as we're going to be working with families, we want to make sure we're doing the best job we can to ensure those families are healthy and supported through quality work. The standards and all the implementation tools that we'll talk about today are available for free on the National Network website for download. So important to mention up front, we're not selling the standards. The standards are available for everyone. We want to make sure everyone's thinking about quality. In terms of how the standards were developed, the standards initially came out of one of our member networks, the California Network of Family Strengthening Networks, that engaged in an 18-month development process to create the standards that we see today. And they started by doing a national scan to look at existing sets of standards from other states, from different fields like social work, to see if there were any existing standards that addressed what they were looking to do, which is to measure quality practice with families across a broad range of programs, and that were based on building the 5 protective factors and informed by the principles of family support. And ultimately, through doing that national scan, they zeroed in on a particular set of standards that was being used in San Francisco, since 2007, which were called the San Francisco Family Support Standards. And I also happen to co-author those standards, so I'm well familiar with those. And the California Network took those standards and then further developed them and vetted them across its network. So its network is comprised of 30 different networks that then represent more than 1,000 programs working with California's families every day. So in super rural areas, in super urban areas, working with families across the spectrum in terms of ethnic diversity, families of children with special needs, lots of different kinds of diversity, and they were vetted with those programs twice, which then ensured that at the end of the day, the standards that were developed were something that could be used across a wide variety of kinds of programs and locations. They were reviewed by the Center for the Study of the Center for the Study of Social Policy, another national organization, the one that developed the 5 protective factors to ensure that they mapped well to building those 5 protective factors. They were adopted by the California Network's membership in 2012, and almost right out of the box by 2013, they went national when the members of the National Family Support Network reviewed standards that different states were using and decided that the ones that came out of California were ones that could be used everywhere. That's how they became national. In terms of the program application of the standards, when we look at how programs implement them, we're talking about program teams coming together to implement the standards. And as you look at and review the standards, when you download them, you'll see that even the way they're written are such that they're not something that a program director could implement by herself or someone working with families in direct service role could implement by himself. It actually requires everybody on the team working together. So that includes management staff as well as direct service staff, parent leaders, and families themselves. So everyone coming together around looking at holistic quality in their programs. The standards, as I've referenced, are based on 2 frameworks. The first is the Principles of Family Support Practice, developed by a national organization that actually no longer exists, but left behind a very valuable piece of work for our field, so the Principles of Family Support Practice that we'll talk about. And then also the research-based, evidence-informed, Strengthening Families Protective Factors framework, developed by the Center for the Study of Social Policy that I referenced earlier. The principles of family support, I'm just going to go over these at a light touch here because in interest of time, all of these principles exist on the National Network website in English, Spanish, and Chinese if you want to review them in more detail later. But just to give you a sense, these are those 9 principles, the first framework that came from Family Support America. And we'll look at the first one here together, the principle that staff and families work together in relationships based on equality and respect. So while this principle may not seem so revolutionary now to many of you on this call, at the time it was written in the early 90s, it was quite a challenge to the system at that time because the prevailing wisdom was that we as the staff were the experts, and it was up to us to figure out how to reach down and fix the problem family. But this first principle of family support, the staff and families work together in relationships based on equality and respect, really challenges that notion, saying, yes, we as a staff come to the table with our education and experience and perspective, but the families also come to that same table with their own knowledge and expertise and strengths and resources. And it's only by working together in partnership that we'll achieve best outcomes together. The other principles of family support cover different points, such as recognizing families as systems, the multiple people in the family, and working with them together will achieve better outcomes. The importance of families being resources to each other, which of course family serving organizations are very well familiar with. Principles related to the importance of embracing diversity and helping families navigate our diverse society, the value of community building, programs being involved in advocating for systems to be responsive and accountable to families served, such as child welfare or human services, education, programs working collaboratively with other programs to mobilize supports for families, programs being flexible and continually responsive, and then also all of the above principles being modeled in everything a program does in terms of how we plan our programs, in terms of how they're administered, and in terms of governance. Who's making decisions about these programs? How are decisions being made? Those are the 9 principles of family support, the first framework, and the second framework is the protective factors framework from the Center for the Study of Social Policy. And back in 2005, what the Center for the Study of Social Policy did was research into looking at what factors, when present, were more likely to ensure a family would be healthy and strong and less likely to experience child abuse and neglect. And with that, they were able to zero in on 5 particular factors that made a difference. The first, parental resilience, that if you think of a palm tree swaying in a wind, that parents may be blown back and forth, but they're able to weather the storm. So how do we support families to be resilient in those kinds of situations? Next, social connection, because we know that when families are connected with other families, that they receive mutual support, peer sharing, and we know that child abuse is highly correlated with social isolation. So ensuring families are connected with other people makes a difference. Concrete support in times of need, helping to support families to be able to access resources, information, and supports when they need them. And all families need help sometimes. Next, knowledge of parenting and child development. So as we all know, children don't come with instruction manuals. So how do we support parents to be aware of what's needed to help support their children's healthy development and what's appropriate to expect of them? And finally, the social emotional competence of children. This has to do with supporting children to be able to express themselves and communicate well with others. So these are the 2 frameworks on which the standards were based, and what the development committee did was to pull those 2 frameworks together and look at these 4 areas of practice that flow off of them. So here are the 5 sections of the standards that those 2 frameworks flow into. Family-centeredness, which has to do with, of course, families being at the center and core to everything we do. Next, family strengthening, so helping to support families to be healthy and strong, promoting their optimal development. Next, embracing diversity, which is both welcoming and embracing whatever diversity families bring to us, as well as supporting them to understand people different than themselves to be able to navigate our larger diverse society. Community building, recognizing that we're not just supporting families through social service work, we're actually seeking to build and strengthen communities. So how do we do that in terms of supporting parent leadership development and our programs being connected with others to build and strengthen and advance communities? And finally, evaluation. Of course, a critical area of work, looking at what's working well, as well as what needs to be modified to further enhance our programs to support and strengthen families well. Those are the 5 sections of the standards. The structure of the standards is that of those 5 sections, there are 17 standards within them. And each of those includes a set of 1 to 2 indicators of both minimum quality and high quality. Minimum quality indicators demonstrate the basic application of the standards, and programs build upon minimum quality to get to high quality, which represents an ongoing and deeper commitment to the application of the standards. You'll also notice in the standards that each indicator is followed by 2 to 4 examples from the field that illustrate its application. So that came from the process of the standards being vetted with those 1,000 programs twice, is that we heard real life examples of what it looked like to implement these standards in practice. And those examples are just that, examples. They're illustrators. It's not a prescriptive list or a checklist of specific things that you need to do. And in working with the standards, you'd be looking at identifying, how do we do this in our programs? How do we see our examples fitting these indicators and standards? Talking more about how the quality indicators work, again, minimum quality indicators on the left there create a solid Family Strengthening and Support Program Foundation. And they're designed to be met within the reasonable scope of resources of any existing program. And this was really important because when we were looking at and vetting those 17 different standards across the country, what we found was standards generally fell into two categories. One was they were written at a level that was designed to meet most programs where they were at, and so then people saw the standards as a checklist, so check, check, yes, we do all those things, and put them aside, never thought about them again. Or standards were written at such a high level that they seemed aspirational, and programs would look at them and say, well, if you give us $1 million, we could do that, but we're nowhere near there, so they put them aside and thought they weren't relevant. And what was unique about the San Francisco standards, which was zeroed in on, and these standards mirror that structure, is it actually does both. Minimum quality is designed to meet programs where they are at, as well as encouraging them to further develop with high-quality work. So high-quality indicators are built upon the minimum being in place first. We don't just jump to high quality. We need that foundation of minimum quality. Programs are encouraged to meet them in order to serve families most effectively, and some may require additional capacity building and investment to work. Implementing the standards is a developmental process. You see a continuum along the bottom there, which starts with minimum quality not yet addressed, approaching minimum quality, meeting minimum quality, so right in the middle, that's where quality begins, and then further meeting minimum and approaching high quality, and then meeting minimum and meeting high, but the arrow continues. And the arrow continues because the use of the standards encourages us to ongoing quality, continuous quality improvement, to continue to look at how can we further deepen and strengthen our practice on an ongoing basis. In terms of moving from minimum to high quality, for the first 4 sections of the standards, we use this arrow here, which is very helpful in terms of the movement from minimum to quality being consistent throughout these sections. Minimum quality on the left you see is foundational, high quality on the right representing deeper integration. And what moves minimum to high quality are the elements in the arrow there. So formal structure, staff training, and family partnership. So let me explain this. So minimum quality, maybe we're doing something in our program that happened to be a good thing we did that day or that week, but how do we ensure it happens next week or next month or 2 years from now? That's where the elements in the arrow come in terms of deepening our practice. So for example, formal structure, when we set up policies, systems, and when we intentionally ensure that these pieces continue over time. When we train our staff, the next element there, ensuring that when staff are trained, that they'll be able to then consistently offer that good practice on an ongoing basis. And finally, family partnership, because when it's not just staff implementing the standards, but families are engaged in the process as well, that again further deepens the practice that this quality work is likely to continue. So those are the 3 elements in the arrow, and those consistently move minimum to high quality for these first 4 sections of the standards. The number of elements differs from indicator pair to indicator pair. So sometimes it's 1, sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's all 3, but it's always of these 3 that are here in this arrow. So looking at an example of this in the very first section of the standards, the family-centeredness section, we're looking at the very first standard, which is FC1, FC standing for family-centeredness. Program encourages families to participate in program development and implementation. On the left, you see minimum quality indicator there. Program solicits input from families to shape and plan the program and services. And on the right, you see the high quality indicator. Programs design supports partnering with families to have an active role in the development and implementation of the program. And you see 2 of the 3 elements in that arrow, formal structure and family partnership. And looking at the words in the high quality indicator that are in bold and italics, those are the ones that reflect what's in the arrow. So this isn't designed to be confusing, it's intentionally designed to be very clear. So for example, the word design is highlighted because that reflects formal structure, and partnering with families, of course, reflects family partnership. This is an example of how the standards look. Moving on to the last section, evaluation, because evaluation is so wonderful and special, has its own arrow. Again, you see minimum quality on the left, which is foundational, high quality on the right, representing deeper integration, but the elements in the arrow are different. So now we're looking at moving from minimum quality, where we're collecting data, to what are we doing with it to get to high quality. So we're looking at analyzing the data. We're looking at sharing our evaluation results with other stakeholders, with funders, with other programs, with the families we serve, promoting that accountability. Program modification. So we don't just do evaluation for evaluation's sake. We do it because we want to continuously improve our programs. So when we take that data and we do something with it to improve the programs, that moves us from minimum to high quality. And finally, training appears in the arrow again, but now it's a specific kind of training to support staff to integrate evaluation into their work. The implementation tools that I mentioned earlier are all available for free download on the National Network website. In addition to the standards, there are these 3 tools. One is the Program Self-Assessment tool. So that is designed to be used by those program teams coming together once they're familiar with the standards to then look at and reflect how are we doing with those standards. And they look at recording their examples of minimum quality, high quality, where they are in that continuum arrow that I showed you earlier as well. Next, the staff self-reflection checklist. So this is a handy one-page sheet that consists of 15 reflection questions that staff could have up in their cubicles or offices or in a common staff area to think about and reflect on how are they doing implementing the standards in their daily practice. And then finally, the standards participant survey. So this is my favorite of the tools because this actually shows us how well the program is doing implementing the standards from the family's point of view. So this consists of 14 questions that mirror those on the staff self-reflection checklist, and it's available in English, Spanish, and Chinese. And it's not a typical satisfaction survey or analyzing a particular program. It's, again, broadly looking at how is the program doing quality work vis-a-vis the standards. Training is a fundamental strategy for implementing the standards effectively, and the National Network, through its members, offers certification training. So this is a one-day training that's available for people working with families, program teams, funders, program officers, everyone to, again, come together and be grounded in what the standards are all about. That one-day training issues a certificate to all participants who successfully complete it that's valid for 2 years. So after 2 years, then they come back either to the certification training or a shorter recertification training to renew their quote-unquote license to drive for working with families effectively. And this is all intentional because we want, again, the standards to be top of mind, that people are continuing to reflect on them in their ongoing work with families and in evaluation of their programs. And then the National Network also offers a Trainers Institute, and this institute is available for our members. So we intentionally train our members within their networks to have trainers so that then they have the capacity and that unique role in their system of care to promote the implementation of standards within their state. That's a 4-day training available to our members. And again, all more information is available on the link that you see there to the training page related to the standards on the National Network website. The standards are also intentionally designed to support network development since, as you know, I mentioned earlier, we're all about networks and we're looking to ensure that that national map is colored in green everywhere. So we've seen some really nice, interesting developments where networks have actually formed and expanded through working with the standards. So for example, in Ohio, we had a private funder who came to us who was interested in training her grantees on the standards. So she contracted with us to bring out the training for 2 days. We trained over 70 people. And then part of her expectations for them was that they would continue to meet as a community of practice quarterly. So they continued to meet as a community of practice. Less than a year later, they called us and said, okay, so we have a network and we're ready to join the national network. So that was really exciting because we saw how the standards could actually bring diversity stakeholders together around shared expectations and commitment to quality work with families and lead to the creation of a network. Other networks we've seen have expanded beyond their existing membership to then bring in other kinds of organizations that might not be the people they were usually working with, but were people working with families that then also wanted to get on page with quality work. And that's also exciting to, again, see the standards used as that common language across diverse stakeholders. And funds generated through the standards trainings are all invested back to support the standards work to continue to support networks moving forward. Application of the standards that I referenced earlier in terms of there being something for all stakeholders. So depending who's on this call today, you may see yourselves in different boxes on this screen. One is for programs working with families. They can use the standards as a blueprint for implementing best practice. They can use them for self-assessment of their programs to now benchmark their work against national standards and to demonstrate the quality of it. For direct service staff, those working directly with families, they can use the standards to reflect on and enhance their work with families. Networks of family support and strengthening providers can use them for quality assurance, training and technical assistance, capacity building, and adopt them as a criteria for membership, for example. Policymakers can endorse the standards for application in their areas of influence. This is something that, speaking from the experience working in California with the San Francisco network, I can tell you working with our elected officials, there's a very clear before and after, before we had standards and after we had standards. Because when we worked with our elected officials after we had standards, we were able to talk about our work like other fields, such as childcare or education or health that have standards, and then talk about how we were all on page about doing quality work with families. And I'll say, I don't think our elected officials cared so much what was in the standards, but the fact that we had standards made a difference. Next, funders can work with the standards by integrating them into requests for proposals, monitoring, and quality assurance. And then finally, families working with the standards can partner with programs to apply them. As you saw, they play a key role in that in terms of moving from minimum to high quality, as well as they provide feedback about how well the program is applying the standards, such as by using that participant survey. There's a question I see in the box here about if there's anything specific about supporting fathers in the standards. As you go through the standards, you'll see there's importance put on the value of engaging multiple family members. And a number of the examples that are listed there relate to involving multiple family members, including fathers, grandparents, kin care, and others. Okay, so now looking at implementing the standards, this is the first of two continua. I'm going to show you very briefly just to let you know it's there because it's way more detailed than we can go into right now. These documents exist on the National Network website. The program implementation continuum outlines the 7 different stages that you'd look at in terms of working with the standards. So those are the steps in the blue arrows at the top. Today we're on the first one, which is prepare. And in the sample activities, you see things you might do in each of those phases during each of those steps, such as learning about the standards like you're doing today. In the gold boxes are the resources that are available either through the national network or through the state networks. And then the blue boxes at the bottom are any costs associated with those steps. And you'll see that attending the certification training is step 3. So the standards, again, are not just about being trained and we're done. That's only step 3 on a 7-step journey. So we continue to work with the standards, working through implementing them and further receiving technical assistance and training, enhancing our work along this continuum. This is the one that's written at the system or network level. So similarly, 7 stages, and again, training would be in the middle of this continuum because it's just a point along the journey to work with the standards. And a key step that's here is developing a network implementation plan, which is the 6th step here. And talking about that, this also shares 2 examples from 2 different networks, one in San Francisco about what's a visual illustration of what a network implementing the standards looks like. And this shows you what it looks like from one network in San Francisco with a 3-pronged strategy. First prong being the training that I talked about earlier, starting with the standard certification training, and then additional trainings and technical assistance that build off of those 5 areas in the standards. Because those 5 areas in the standards, each of them is rich and wonderful, and there's so much to explore, we can't do that in depth in just one day, right? So this calls us to then look at providing further technical assistance training that goes deeper. So let's say through looking at the family strengthening section, we determined that, you know what, we have some more work to do with engaging dads. So then we would look at accessing additional training, technical assistance in our areas to help us go further with that. And then the standards recertification is at the end of that prong. The middle prong is using use of the assessment tools that I talked about, and the last prong is membership, that being part of this network means using the standards, and that's actually a membership requirement and expectation and how that all works. Here's another example that comes from Colorado of implementation. This one is focused on training, and this illustrates visually, really simply, how the standards training is layered or added in to other trainings that the network might do. So on the left, you see the level of program responsibility in that arrow, and then in the pyramid, it starts with the bottom is the standards of quality training, and that's the one-day training. And in the Colorado network, everyone working at the centers, the family resource centers, goes through the standards training. So whether you're the executive director, your direct service staff, whether you're answering the phone, everyone goes through that standards training. That's the base of the pyramid, that everyone's grounded in quality practice. Now, one level up, that's when they use the Strengthening Families Protective Factors training. There's a wonderful 14-hour free training for that available through the National Alliance of Children's Trust and Prevention Funds. There's also now an in-person training that they offer as well, and there are also trained trainers for that across the country, many of whom are also cross-trained to be trainers on these standards of quality. And so in Colorado, for folks who are working with families and those directly supervising them, they also go through that 14-hour Strengthening Families training. And then finally, at the top, the Family Development Credential. So this is a 60-hour training that in Colorado, they use that for people working directly with families, and that ensures that they have the tools they need to support families well. So you see how all this comes together in the pyramid with the different pieces connecting with each other. Okay, in terms of, since the standards were first issued, some things that have moved forward that we want to share with you, some highlights. One is that Colorado network that I mentioned commissioned an independent literature review to look at the key components of effective family resource centers. And they were able to zero in on 7 particular key components. And it turns out all of those components are reflected in the standards, which was seen as independently confirming, yes, we were on the right track with the pieces that were focused on in the standards. That report is on the National Network website as well. Parents as Teachers, another national organization with its home visiting program, took the national standards, these standards, and mapped them with their standards as well. So now there is actually a crosswalk tool that their programs can use to map how what they're doing following their standards is also meeting the national network standards, which was seen as a great way to help them not only enhance their language, but then also be able to communicate with other programs working with families outside of the Parents as Teachers world. In terms of how the standards training has rolled out nationwide, this map here shows you where the standards training has happened to date, where that one-day certification training has happened. You'll see that there have been more than 200 trainings offered nationwide. You'll see that a number of these states correlate to the ones that were green on that earlier map, but it also includes states that don't currently have networks that are members, such as Illinois and Louisiana, because you don't have to have a network or even have family resource centers to use the standards. You just have to have programs that are working with families and someone to have the interest in bringing that training to town to bring everyone on page about quality work with families. There are more than 5,500 people certified on the standards from coast to coast now, which continues to amaze me because I remember when this first started. And then we have 100 trained trainers across the country as well from the different states. And you also see the evaluation scores here. The training is something that has been well received and people see as very relevant and helpful to their work. Some of the things that are new is based on the kinds of needs we were seeing emerge from the certification training as it took off across the country, is the National Network developed a second training which focuses specifically on developing and sustaining effective parent advisory committees. This is a training specifically for staff. There's a lot of wonderful training out there we've seen for parents to support leadership development and serving on parent advisory committees, but we saw that there was not an equivalent for staff. So how to support staff and programs to be ready to welcome families into shared leadership roles. So this builds on the emphasis on parent leadership development within the standards and the reference to parent advisory committees a number of times in the examples that programs participating in the training kept coming to us and saying, parent advisory committees sound great, now how do I do it? And so that's why we developed this training here that flows off of the standards. Again, an example of how you can go further with the standards to then more specific pieces that continue to build your work. Post-certification trainings, surveys are now something that we do. So as people go through the standards training, we now survey them at 3 months and 9 months to see how well it's going for them implementing the standards. And then also there's a new crosswalk out, which is a crosswalk with a trauma-informed approach, which is really interesting. I remember when I went to a first workshop about trauma-informed approach, I was really excited to hear about it. It was the latest thing that everyone was talking about. And when I went through the session, I realized that 80% of what they were talking about with trauma-informed work is actually already in the standards, such as meeting families where they're at and recognizing them as equals and partners at the table and such. That's all in the standards already. So why adopt quality standards? Well, this is what we've heard from feedback across the country about states and funders and such who have chosen to engage and work with the standards. One is that it deepens practice. Two is establishing that common language, which we talked about the value of that earlier. Next, creating shared measurement systems because of all the tools that go along with the standards. Now you can actually not only talk about quality, but measure it and talk about that in a consistent way. Opportunities to develop partnerships that we talked about before. Once people are speaking the same language, then it gives us the opportunity to build bridges and make connections to deepen practice with families. And the excitement of being part of a national movement. This is something that's a huge and historic development for our field to be able to talk about our work as other fields do. And so there's an excitement to being able to be part of that and connected with it. In terms of resources the National Network has, in addition to the ones I've mentioned already, we have a webinar every month on the second Wednesday of every month, part of our Webinar Wednesday series. The second Wednesday of every month is when we have a webinar specifically focused on the standards, and it goes into more detail than we have time for today. You can also find archived recordings of those monthly webinars on our website as well if you want to look at them, and then you can register for the upcoming February one on our website. Other resources on the website, you can look at the upcoming certification trainings. So if you happen to be in one of those states that has trainers, you can look at that schedule there to see when the training is next offered in your state. And then there are sometimes the training is also offered in Washington, D.C. or in conjunction with National Network events. That's an open training that anyone could come to as well. And this is a contact info for the various staff of the National Family Support Network, myself in DC, our membership manager in upstate New York, and our director of training. So for anything related to training, you can call her Samantha, who's based in Chicago, Illinois. So that's us. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you so much for both the overview and all the rich resources that you offer through the network. There's obviously a lot of interest based on the questions, and we should have a nice question and answer session toward the end of this. You can see that these really align with what we do in systems of care and what family-run organizations do. And Andrew mentioned several ways that you can use these standards in your community or state. There are family-run organizations in Oregon and Arizona that have been trained in and use these standards in their work with families, providers, and systems. So starting with Oregon and then moving to Arizona, we're going to hear next of their experiences from the field. I'm going to turn it over to Tammy.
Yeah, hi everyone, and thanks for joining us today. I'm going to start by just saying that Oregon is really in the beginning stages of this work, and I think it's a unique opportunity for us to kind of share what we've done so far for other organizations that might be considering this or not too far along in the planning. So we really started the conversation as a state because we had members of our organization sitting at system of care meetings, and one of the obstacles that probably many of you can relate to is that systems had their own language of talking about how they were supporting families and how they knew that they were doing quality work. And so the first kind of impetus behind this conversation in Oregon was that the standards allowed for some shared understanding, some shared language that could be used across systems. And so we used that to really bring together a large group of folks just by invitation. And these were members of either organizations or state entities that were supporting families and youth in some way. One of the interesting things that happened just in the sheer time that we spent, the first meeting was about 3 hours, and it was energizing because what we were hearing is that this shared language brought new opportunities for collaboration, not just among partners at the table, but certainly partnerships for our organization as a family-run organization. A couple of the other pieces of our kind of impetus behind this was the evaluation components of the standards, and that organizations supporting families could utilize the standards no matter where they were in development, that it really allowed groups to come together and simply say, where am I and where do I want to go? And then some really helpful tools in terms of how to get to that place I want to go, or at least further down the continuum. The other unique maybe aspect that we didn't plan for was that in our initial conversations, we had one of our larger grant foundations attend the meeting, and their focus is around community, family, youth engagement, and safety. And they were very interested in the opportunity to use the standards as a framework for organizations that were applying for grants, but to use the standards as a way of saying, this is the benchmark that we want you to be working towards. So that was another kind of outgrowth of that initial conversation that we didn't anticipate, but has been a wonderful component of our ongoing conversation. So from that initial conversation, which the first one was about 3 hours, and I think we had 2 additional meetings, statewide meetings after that, we then brought the quality of standards training to Oregon. We hosted 2 different trainings and certified 40 or so participants, and so you'll see there are groups. These are all individuals who are working either in nonprofits serving families, state agencies serving families, could be education, special education, etc. And then the next step, so that was in October. So we have an upcoming meeting, which all of these folks have now joined a learning community. So you'll see that on this slide where we start talking about what are our next steps. The folks who went through the certification training are now forming a learning community. And really what they're doing is beginning to document how they're implementing the standards, what strategies they're using across different environments. So whether they're working in education or they're working in the DHS system or they're working for a family-run organization, they're really creating some documentation about how they're implementing and what are the outcomes related to that. One of the other next steps is that, as I mentioned earlier, our system of care groups across the state have, in varying levels, kind of been interested in this concept of using the standards to inform and to maybe allow them to have shared conversation. We have a system of care in one of our counties that is actually getting ready to dig deeper into the standards as a way of measuring how they're serving families and using those tools to move from maybe where they are in minimum to high quality. I mentioned, we're going to continue to use the standards to really build bridges for conversations across those systems that have traditionally had, maybe a different language or a different way of speaking, but are all at the core of their work to support families and youth. And then finally, we are in the process of, we've actually identified who our state trainers are going to be and are in the process of moving towards having some folks in Oregon who can offer the certification training on an ongoing basis so that we can really reach deeper into many of those organizations that initially either sent representatives or have been involved in the standards of quality conversations. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my colleague, Tony, because I know she's been working at a much longer period of time with the standards, and I'm excited to hear from her as well.
Thank you, Tammy. Hi, this is Tony Donnelly. I'm really excited to share pieces of the standards with you that we've been able to implement in Arizona. We started our journey with the standards in 2012 when I was asked to sit on a steering committee of our local Maricopa Family Support Alliance, which was a grassroots coalition of service providers that came together that wanted to focus on how to improve family support for families in our Maricopa County. And Maricopa is the largest county in Arizona, and many of the organizations in that, were probably now 82 strong, have a statewide presence in Arizona. And so for us, the Family Involvement Center, which is a family-run organization, two of our staff submitted applications to be trainers through the Maricopa Family Support Alliance, were vetted through them, and then our applications went to the national network to be approved. And then once we were approved, we went to the Train the Trainer so that we would become certified to train the standards within our state. Currently, we have 5 trainers in the state of Arizona, and 2 of them come from our Family Involvement Center staff. In our in our state, agencies, we've adopted the standards as a capacity building initiative rather than something that is required by funders to do. So different than some of the other states that have implemented the standards, it's all about capacity building and really just people being passionate about these standards and taking them forward within their organizations. Our requirements are to provide a minimum of 2 trainings a year to keep the certification current. And because of our Family Support Alliance, we were actually able to get funding for our organization by providing the training to other organizations. So we could actually invoice our alliance and bring in some income as trainers, which is really great. Just like Oregon was talking about community of practices or learning communities, we found that just doing the training wasn't enough. We had a lot of organizations that really wanted support and help in developing and implementing the practices, and so we started doing a couple of community practices. And the trainers from various organizations, we got together and then we co-facilitated based on what the survey was from our providers about what they wanted to work on first. So that has been really helpful in implementing the standards. We have a couple organizations within our community that have adopted this standards throughout their entire organization. So in terms of our organization implementing the standards, we started this basically within our training program. And one of the first things that we did was we provided the staff reflection checklist to our trainers to review daily. So our trainers were not only training fellow staff, but they were also working with families in our community. And at the end of every one of those family education trainings that we offered, our families used the participant survey at the end of that, and from that we were able to solicit information for future trainings using one of the other tools that are part of the standards, which is the 360 tool, where you get feedback from families for future trainings. In terms of our organization, our management team decided that we would use the self-evaluation tool in our monthly leadership meetings. And so we did the complete self-assessment, and it took us about 6 months actually to do it. And that's the other beauty of these standards. You can implement these as quickly as you want, or you can take your time with it. There's no prescribed way necessarily to do it. So we started with low-hanging fruit. We already had a meeting, and we thought we'll use that meeting to complete the assessment tool. Once we did that, the area where we thought we could do the most amount of improvement was with the Embracing Diversity standards. So you'll see here the standards listed at the top. Embracing Diversity is Standard 2.1. Program enhances the ability of families and staff to participate in and navigate the dynamics of a different society. So the minimum quality indicator was on the left, is program offers opportunities for families to learn about diversity and to navigate the dynamics of difference. And so part of how we did that was we purchased books. We started a book club to address attitudinal bias and stigma in our community. And not only did we do that with our staff, we also included professional partners and families to be part of these book clubs. So you'll see the arrow that moves us from minimum quality to high quality is formal structure. And what we did within our organization to implement the formal structure around this book club was to have a formal time to meet monthly We had a facilitator that we either hired out or one of our staff took the place of a facilitator to facilitate the book club discussions every month. So we had one staff doing it with adults and families, and then we also implemented a youth book club for younger children and their parents, and that became a really popular events that we hosted. In addition to that, we had post surveys for the book club around facilitation, and then families were able to give us their recommendations for future book topics. Additionally, in terms of embracing the standards, now we're looking at Standard DD 1.2, program acknowledges and respects the diversity of families, including cultural traditions, languages, and so on. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the minimum quality is program is aware of and reflects the diversity of families served. So our staff at Family Involvement Center reflect Arizona's wider population in a multiple ways. They represent various socioeconomic backgrounds, cultural upbringing, religious beliefs, racial and ethnic identities, and personal life experiences. Our staff identify themselves as Caucasian, Latino, Native American, African American, and multiracial. Many of our staff are bilingual, and they can also provide services to our families in their primary language. One of the things that we did in terms of moving this from, so really, when you look at this, minimum quality is actually that our staff reflect the diversity of families served. So then how would we move this to high quality? In order to do that, we needed a formal structure. And part of what we do at our organization is we have an internal cultural competency committee, and we developed an internal competency plan. And so we also related that to class standards. So in this one, the class standard that relates to this is class standard number 3, to recruit, promote, and support a culturally and linguistically diverse governance, leadership, and workforce that is responsible to the population in the service area. So we formed a group that met regularly, an internal cultural competence committee, which became our formal structure that moved us to high quality here. In addition to that, we wanted to make sure that our families were actually able to see what we were doing in terms of cultural diversity. And so on our webpage, we actually have a cultural health page and a financial health page. On our cultural health page, let me go back just for a moment, I'm sorry. On our cultural health page, we actually have listed our class standards and our cultural competency plan so that our community can actually see what we're working on in terms of embracing diversity. And in addition to that, we've linked family stories to the class standards. So if you were to go on our website and go onto our cultural health page, you would read, there's probably 3 or 4 stories on there right now that actually link to the class standards. And we thought that was a pretty innovative way to connect families to our standards. And so that's another thing that we did. Oops, sorry, went too fast. And then in terms of the program enhancing the ability of families and staff to participate in a diverse society and navigate the dynamics of difference, we felt that our staff were struggling a little bit in this area when we went through the program self-assessment. And so what we did is we actually did a survey. Initially, we sent out 2 surveys to staff, one wanting to know what topics for cultural competency were of interest, and then to survey staff on how their child's behavioral health impacted their physical health. And so as we did that, we then facilitated a brown bag breakfast and went over the survey results to get input from all of our staff regarding what could we do in terms of whole health initiatives in our organization that would help children and families. And so after gathering all that survey data, what would move us to high quality in this particular standard is staff training. And so what we did then was started implementing some trainings within our organization. So we trained our staff on Embracing Diversity 101. We also included a cultural potluck with all staff. And then twice a year we offer cultural brown bag breakfasts or lunches that have a variety of different topics. And so what we've covered so far is the face of poverty. We had 2 different workshops on gang culture. We've done training with for our staff on the LGBTQ community, as well as class standards and cultural humility. So these are just a couple examples of how we implemented standards in Embracing Diversity, and I will turn it over now to Millie.
Thanks, Tony and Tammy. You both have provided some really specific ways that you have used the standards, and both internally and externally, that I think are helpful to system of care sites as they're thinking about embedding quality family support. So we now have some time for some Q&A, and there are a couple of questions that have come in. And I think that we're going to start with something from Liz Sweet. She asked, how is the issue of parents having to relinquish custody of their child to access mental health services addressed in this framework? That might be for you, Andrew, but both Tammy and Tony, if you have examples from your communities, that'd be great too.
Yeah, I would say that level of specificity is not covered in these standards. I welcome Tony or Tammy to share if they have some perspective from their areas. I would say, however, that may very well be an example of the systems change piece that we talked about earlier when we were talking about the need to work with families to advocate for systems to be fair, responsive, and accountable. So if that comes up as an example of a system that isn't working that way, then of course the standards call attention to, we want to be working with families to identify systems like that and mobilize support to address them.
Thank you. Are there any examples, Tammy or Tony, that you want to add or comment? That's definitely something that we still see occurring, is families having to give up custody to access what their children need. It's an ongoing system issue that I think that we all try to address in our advocacy work. Thank you, Liz, for bringing that up. The other questions we've gotten have to do specifically with the standards and then with training. Again, Liz asked, how are organizations held accountable to the certification?
Right. So again, this is going to vary from place to place because the National Network issues the tools and offers the training, our members offer the training, but then within the systems of care within states, then the funders, the systems decide how they're going to implement the standards. So again, if funders include them in RFPs and monitoring processes, that's one way the programs would be held accountable. But we as a National Network don't prescribe that or dictate that. You know, it's up to the states and the funders to think about how to do that. And the standards are also set up very intentionally that we do not certify programs. That's very intentional because it's all about the granular level of working with families that are the people who are working with families, right? So it wouldn't make sense for us to put out a sign and say, yep, this program has a good housekeeping seal of approval, and then 6 months later, half the staff have turned over. So to clarify, we don't certify organizations, we certify individuals, which also means that then that certification becomes another credential for them that they take with them, regardless of whether they continue to work for that organization or go elsewhere in the future.
Thank you. I think that maybe it was Tony that mentioned that there's a requirement to do 2 trainings a year to keep up their certification. Tammy or Tony, do you have anything to say about how your state makes sure that you stay accountable?
So that's what I was sharing in the beginning. Our state chose not to go the route of having the standards as a requirement or a required element in programming. The Maricopa Family Support Alliance adopted the standards solely as a capacity initiative to help organizations collaborate and provide family support, but it was not mandated. People did this of their own volition. So it's not required here in this state. I do know that other states have done that, though. So it's just a matter of how your state would like to implement the standards going forward.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thanks, Tony. Is there a certain number of people who need to be trained for this to happen in a particular area?
Well, if the question is about how many people are needed for training, I'm not sure if that's it, or if we're talking about implementation beyond training. So feel free to specify that question more if you like. But in terms of the number of people for training, we would recommend you have a minimum of 18 people for the training, and the maximum is 36. So we can train up to 36 in a day. So if you're thinking about the number of people who might be trained, the number of organizations and people coming in teams, that may lead to thinking about a couple days of training in order to train up everybody. So we'd say the minimum is 18 and the maximum per day is 36. You could also have 2 trainings run simultaneously on a day. We've done that some places as well, where 36 are trained in a day in 2 different training rooms.
Wow,
that would be 72 are trained in a day. Yes.
Yes. Yep. Also, there was a question about Laura May noticed that there was a training that's near her. It's open to outside participants, but there's no information about how to sign up on that. Would that be through that state network, or how would she access that?
Yeah, so the information would be on the national network website whenever it's available. So if it's going to be on the state network website, they would give us that, and it would link from the national network website. So you can always go there. And I don't know where you're talking about, because I'm not sure. It looked like if that person was in Virginia. I don't know if you're talking about the Washington, D.C. one, which is coming up in May, which we just haven't opened registration for that yet. But if it's more specific question, feel free to check in with me about that if you can't find what you're looking for.
Laura also asked about becoming a member of the National Family Support Network, and I know that you have that on your website, which we shared in the chat box, but if you want to comment on how they access that information.
Sure, I'd be happy to, and Laura has already sent me an email as well about this, so appreciate
Laura's on the ball.
Prompt interest. So a couple things to mention to frame this for everybody. So our membership is very particular. It's networks of family support and strengthening programs. So that's not one organization. It's a minimum of 2 organizations, because it's networks of 2 or more family support and strengthening programs. So we don't take individual members, and we only take 1 member per state, so 1 network for a whole state. So in some states where there may be multiple networks, for example, in Arizona, there's a network in Maricopa County that's very strong. As Tony mentioned, there's also a network in the southern part of the state, and we would not admit 2 different members from one state. We would encourage those two networks to come together to coordinate however they may do that, and then they join as one joint member for a state. So just to share that as well. So the membership information, yes, as you said, there's on the membership page, you can look at our membership agreement and what's expected of our members, what the benefits are. That's all there, and happy to talk with you further because it may not be your organizations are the right fit for members, but maybe you know of the stakeholders we should be talking with in your states, which typically are points of entry are folks who are either working at the systems level already, like children's trust funds we talk to a lot, or funders at the state level that are supporting different programs, or they're also programs. So for example, in Oregon, as Tammy mentioned, we went there and her organization called together different community-based organizations to come together, and some funders joined as well, and I came to then share the national context, explain what's going on in other states, introduce the standards, and then lead a facilitated discussion about what it might look like in Oregon and get a sense of the lay of the land from the participants. So that's a service the National Network also has available, which is to help states explore talking about this and looking at network development in your areas. So feel free to contact me if you want to talk about that further.
Mm-hmm. And there's also on the PowerPoint slide, there's a contact page that Andrew inserted in there, as well as all of the presenters have their contact information in the last few slides, along with more resources. The way you answered that may have answered Joy's question about if you only certify individuals, why is there only one designated entity? And I think you may have answered that, but Joy, do you want to expand on that, or was your question answered? I want to make sure. Mm-hmm. Okay, she says she'll probably just contact you.
Yeah, okay. And I would just add on to that is that why it's one holder of the trainer per seat is because, again, it's all supporting network development. So our network then has that unique role within their system of care, but that network may call upon its members to be trainers. So exactly as Tony shared in Maricopa County, that's a perfect example because the network isn't, has a whole bunch of staff. The network is actually coordinated by a contractual person, a consultant, and then they put out the call for members of their network to then step up to become trained trainers. So from different organizations, but all within the auspices of the network. So when they're doing the training on behalf of the Maricopa network, not on behalf of their own individual organization. I hope that helps.
Okay, are there any other questions? We have a few minutes left in this learning community. Given us a lot to think about, and I love the parallels between this work and the work that we do in system of care and trying to pull everyone together on the same page, have common languages, all try to do quality service that's family driven. It looks like we don't have any other questions. Wait, there may be one coming in. No, that was a thank you. Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, then I want to thank our presenters today, as well as Tiara for handling our technology needs. There is a brief, very brief survey that will pop up as soon as we close this out. If you would just take just a second and complete that, it would be very helpful to us. Thank you for participating in today's learning community, and look for upcoming learning community calls in the weekly TA